Stephen Marche, all the way from Canada. Let's get a hello.
Hello.
Hello, thanks so much for joining us. I'm not sure if you sort of followed or understood any of what Mark was talking about. It was something about the King of
yeah.
Okay,
very interesting. Yeah.
It was something about the King of Egypt and words sometimes fail. What's the conclusions did you draw from his peroration, as Victoria called it?
Well, I think one of the things about writing and the process of advancing writing is that it always contains within it a loss, and a loss of sense. And I mean, Plato, of course, is the big one, going to actual literacy. But Trithemius, who wrote on scribal practice, in the immediate aftermath of the printing press, he wrote this incredible book about what would be like against the printing press, right?
Yeah.
And everything that would be lost with the printing press and everything. And the thing is, it's very easy to dismiss these arguments. It's very easy to think like, well, yeah, but on the other hand, I, who come from a bunch of Italian peasants, would not be a writer or have any access to literacy without print or without these things. But on the other hand, the things they describe as what are being lost, they are lost. Right. And it's I think it's very important to recognize that with every kind of leap forward, we do actually lose something.
Yeah. With the invention of movable type, you lost the illuminated manuscript.
And the cute, my PhD is actually in Renaissance drama. And I mean, in the 16th century, it was perfectly common for schoolboys to have such good memories that they could go to a play, listen to it, and remember everything that was said in it and write it down afterwards.
Yeah.
Right. And that was a taught skill that just lost. It just lost its value. And for other reasons. But that is a loss.
Yeah.
How did we get onto the subject of
Well, let's hop back to the book. I read this again the last couple of days for the second time. And I mean, it's such an enjoyable read. It's very funny. It's very literary, and it's cram-packed with fantastic anecdotes. And but it's really sad. It sort of makes you wonder why anyone would want to be a writer, because the best outcome you can possibly hope for is poverty and obscurity. Much worse things happen to writers and have happened to them. Let's take the example of, we were talking just now about this unbelievable thing that happened to Dostoevsky in the mid-19th century. Could you just tell that story again? Because I mean, I had heard of it, but the way you sort of clarify it and retell it in the book, and it's even more sort of horrifying than the sort of half-remembered anecdote that I had that many of us might have in our minds.
Yeah, I mean, when I started to write this book, I sort of had a notebook of like terrible things that happened to writers that I kept just for myself, because I found it much more cheering than like happy stories. Like it's much better to know that like the story of like J.K. Rowling hitting it rich doesn't really do much for me. Yeah. But knowing that all these other writers would just feel like garbage all the time too actually does make me feel better. But what I was amazed at when I came to do the book and was like, okay, well, now I have to actually research this, find out what happened, like rather than the, what I assumed would be a bunch of urban legends. Like I assumed it'd be like half true, or like I'd misheard something and it got passed down and it was much, it wasn't as bad as I thought it was. It was always much worse. It was always like when you actually like dive into the biographies and like see the details. In the case of Dostoevsky, I mean, he was part of this reading group of an anarchist writer, and they all got seized by the Tsarist forces, and they were condemned to death. And then there was a reprieve. And this was actually a very common thing, not just in Russia and other places, but it would happen in other places where you go through some formal version of being executed with all the rituals, but then the Tsar or the king or whatever would save your life at the last moment. Ordinarily, this was just basically paperwork and a ceremony. But the people that did it to Dostoevsky said, we're going to go all the way. And so they drove them out to Simeonov Square. They had coffins in they had coffins set up to take away the dead bodies. The guys were put, tied to the stake where they were going to be shot. The guy in the first three of them, one of them literally went stark raving mad, like just had a complete nervous breakdown and went completely insane and had to be put in an asylum for the rest of his life. And they were like literally pointed the guns at them, counted the beats, and then stopped and had the guy ride up and give them all commutations. So they really went like the extra mile to torture Dostoevsky. Like they really, like if you think about how much work is required to set up this illusion that you're about to assassinate these people, it's quite extraordinary. And obviously, I think it's not too hard to see in that scene so much that's in Dostoevsky, right? Like so much that's in the later work, particularly in The Idiot, but in all of it, really.
It was a gift to him. I mean, look at it another way. I mean, what writer wouldn't kill for that sort of material? There was a famous joke about Martin Amos in the 80s, that most unlikely book title, My Struggle by Martin Amos.
Right, but I'm sure by the end of it, I mean, he'd written Yellow Dog. I mean, everyone thought he was, some guy's kid who turned, like, you know what I mean? Like, I'm sure he was plenty of struggles. I mean, I do think, I think with Dostoevsky, there's also the really interesting part of the story is that while he's being led to his death, he talks to the guy next to him about all the great novels he was going to write. And then when his sentence is commuted, he writes to his brother about all the books he's going to be able to write. I mean, it's just like, give the careerism a break for like 10 minutes, but he didn't. He didn't. Like, I mean, it's just so classic. It's like, you're going to be killed. Maybe don't worry about the paperback rights to your next story. Like, but that's another part of the aspect of writers.
Well, it's always been difficult, hasn't it, Stephen? And you do some great stuff on Dr. Johnson. I love that. Dr. Johnson's the patron saint of the Idler. We stole the name from him. He wrote essays called The Idler. He was our first cover star in the 90s. And you tell the story of his friendship when he was really quite impecunious, and his friendship with this kind of disreputable character called Richard Savage.
Yeah, well, he wasn't impecunious. He had a wife who needed more money than he could provide. That's not really the same thing as just blowing money, right? Savage, on the other hand, wasted money all the time. Like, he famously bought, there's a fashion for scarlet doublets with gold buttons, and he bought one even though you could see his toes through his shoes. And that was apparently the definition. I was like, oh, classic Richard Savage. And then when his friends basically, and I mean, reading between the lines, like Johnson's history of Savage is incredibly flattering, the most flattering possible introduction. But reading between the lines, you're like, well, he's making these claims with the Countess of Hertfordshire that are probably nonsense. He kills a guy in a coffee shop over a seat by the fire. He spends all his money. His friends eventually take up a subscription with the one condition that he has to stay in Bath. He can't go back to London and blow, the money. And he goes to London and blows the money. No, he goes to Bristol and blows the money. and he dies in debtor's prison. But there's not a lot you could do with a guy like that. And I mean, obviously, one of the things that is like, writers, I think there's a lot of talk about like what kind of people are writers. I don't think there's any kind of people who are writers, right? And I don't think there's one type you can find. There's not a kind of typology, I don't think. Yeah. And so he was just a there are people like that in other walks of life, for sure. It just happened to be Johnson's friend.
And then even for, as you say very often in the book, this feeling of failure, perhaps you never get enough reviews, the book didn't, if the book does sell, it doesn't sell enough, so and so didn't mention it. I mean, this was again true for Dr. Johnson. I like quoting his line, mark what ills, I'm sure you know this, being a literary gentleman, mark what ills the scholar's life assail, toil, envy, want, the patron, and the jail.
Right.
You know,
I mean,
so
he was
like
sort of
envy.
a moment between. He was sort of in a moment like our own moment. I mean, that's
Yeah.
my contention about Johnson,
Okay.
where
Well,
there was sort of,
18th century was a bit like now. It was just
yeah.
Grub Street. They were scrabbling around.
Well, and it hadn't yet developed, right?
Yeah.
Like they were stuck between modes, right?
Mm.
They were stuck between patronage and professionalism, and in the gap between, like there was just not a lot of writing, right? And or the writing was of, and if you look at what Johnson did for those magazines, I mean, he was a pure hustler, right? I mean, he really was out there doing everything that you could. I mean, prostitute life stories, and then he's rewriting the parliamentary debates under fake names, and then he's holding contests, poetry contests that he's trying to make money from, and then he's doing poems in Latin to like class the joint up a bit. I mean, he's really out there working. But I mean, he was sort of like us, I think, in this moment of extreme transition,
Yeah.
right, where like the whole modes of discourse are dying and other ones are being born, and there's gaps between them.
And the picture, I suppose, I was thinking when reading the book, Stephen, what do you think about this? I mean, in the second half of the 19th century, the Dickensian period, Dickens was just one of, obviously there was no telly, no internet, and there was actually I think there was an Education Act that really played into the hands of the writers. So, from 1850 to 1900 kind of thing, that was the golden age. I mean, you could write for Punch, the fees were high. There were hundreds of. There was another magazine called The Idler, which Jerome ran. And for illustrators as well, like got John Tenniel, Punk. There were so many of these magazines. So, do you think that was true? That was a sort of easier time in a way for writers, the sort of second.
Well, for the novel, for the
yeah.
novel, right? I mean, of course, it's easy to say that, but like I remember reading about Dickens, because there was no Copyright Act, right? His in adjusted dollars for today, I remember reading how much he made over the course of his career. Would you care to take a guess how much Charles Dickens made in, I think it was $2015 for Charles Dickens' whole career? Would you take a guess how much he made?
Well, in his dollar, I mean, I think he actually made quite a lot from his tours, didn't he?
He made the equivalent his entire career of $10 million.
Yeah, it does sound
so
today's money, yeah.
In today's money. So you're talking about someone who's writing himself to death.
Yeah.
He's producing mega hits.
He's going to
New York. His boat is greeted when he arrives at New York, right? Like he is Spielberg meets Shakespeare. He's just so massive. But because there was no copyright law, he's not really getting that rich over. Right. Yeah. So the guy invented Christmas, and he doesn't really get a lot of money from it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, so I think he would have his complaints too.
Yeah.
I mean, as I said, like Shakespeare died with unproduced plays.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like he died with things that he'd written that never were performed. Now, so I don't think it spares anyone really.
No. And why would anyone do this? Why did you become a writer? I mean, Victoria gave your biography. You sound pretty successful. You've written a lot of books. That's probably and published them and sold them and been published in lots of magazines. Probably more than most writers could sort of dream of, really. But you obviously feel this thing you wanted to write about the truth of writing and to get this message across to other people, in particular, perhaps the people you call the kid writers, the younger people. Who sort of unaccountably look up to you, perhaps?
I mean, certainly when I was doing a lot of more magazine work, I would talk to a lot of. Well, the thing that I got is that there was a sense that if you worked hard, you would get to the end of it, right? And then you would suddenly feel successful, and that all of these, and that you would then feel like you'd arrived. And it was, what started happening is I started meeting really successful writers, like writers who were successful by any cover of Time writers, these kind of things, and realizing that they were like did not feel at all like they had arrived, or felt like or felt like it was all falling apart, or were just extremely neurotic. I mean, like like who is married to these people kind of neuroses, right? Like, you know, and so that was kind of one thing where I realized like this actually doesn't ever go away.
Yeah.
And it's not, I think it has something specific to do with the process of writing. Like, I think it's not just, you know, being worried about success or something like that, or it actually has to do integrally with the process of writing. And that became sort of like, why would that be? Like, why would you feel like that? And the answer has to do really with the process of writing, which is mostly throwing things out, right? And mostly rejecting yourself and then getting rejected by others and then being misunderstood. And for this very faint, removed sense of connection across distance, which is, you know, incredibly uniquely powerful, but is very fraught. And it is uniquely powerful. Like, I mean, this is an affirmative book, I would say. Like, this is not a book that is, you know, don't get involved here. This is a book that is like, do this, but, you know, you should know what the cost of it is. That was what I really wanted to do, is like, what is the cost of doing this? And also know that you have to pay. Like, there's not going to come a point where you don't have to pay. You have to pay.
So good writing, you're saying, I mean, what's the point of it when we get back down to it? Because, I mean, we love it. Is it because it makes us feel, you know, is it an escape? Is it, I mean, certainly when reading this book myself, I mean, I was just laughing, and it did, you know, it was sort of simultaneously cheering and sad at the same time. As you said, it's actually more cheering to read these sad stories. And perhaps like comedy, good writing makes you feel less alone. Is that what it is? I mean, what is the point of it?
Well, I call it the alleviation of a minuscule cosmic loneliness. But you know, obviously writing is done for all kinds of reasons, right? And I think one of the things that's, and with all kinds of effects, and one of the things that's really fascinating about writing, and you do figure this out as you mature and as you write a bunch of different things, is that the really successful things are not where your information is being communicated to somebody else. Like, that's not, it's rather when there's this kind of free play where something means something to other people in a way that you would never have imagined. That's a truly magical, powerful experience. And of course, you know, as a reader, you know it, right? Like, I mean, the first things when you're a reader and you first feel that experience where it's like, you know, John Keats wrote On Melancholy for me, right? When I was 15 in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, right? Like, he didn't, you know, none of those places existed when he was writing it, but he wrote that for me. And I felt that, and I think all readers kind of feel that in a very pronounced way. And when you feel it as a writer, you know, that is the win. Everything else is kind of awful, right? And but when you get that kind of, that registration, that feeling that you've you know, you've communicated across these differences, you're with somebody in their privacy, right? I mean, that is the thing about writing, right? Is that it's a private activity. Like, I wrote this book 2 years ago in Toronto in the middle of COVID. You're reading it now. Like, that distance, that's both the torture of it, but it's also the kind of greatness of it, you know, is that it has this unique way of reaching into people's privacies that is just that no other art form, I think, can compete with.
Yeah, across
right?
as you say,
yeah, across the
centuries, across the millennia, across the countries.
Yeah. I mean, I know from reading Li Bai that I have a common humanity with somebody who lived in 9th century China.
Yeah,
that's a hugely powerful and humanizing reality. You know, and I think it is something that is absolutely to be cherished. But it also comes at, you know, there's a reason why it's so hard to get to. Like, it's a huge distance.